What if your brain wasn't only shaped by your thoughts, but by the spaces that hold them? We often think change starts inside us, but what if it also origins from around us? Welcome to the HAUS Hub podcast, your go-to space where design, cognitive sciences, well-being, and business come together. I'm your host, Monika Acosta, and today you're tuning into a Neurodesign Capsule, an exploration into how the spaces we dwell in can engage our senses, shape our thoughts, and quietly guide our behavior. This podcast is powered by HAUS, born from its mission to guide designers on how to create spaces for well-being grounded in cognitive sciences principles. Let's dive in. I've always had this quiet feeling that space changes people. You feel it in your body long before your mind can explain it. There's a shift, sometimes subtle, sometimes immediate, when you walk into a room and something softens inside you. Or when your shoulders tense, your breath catches, and you just know something is off or not. That awareness might seem small, but it's not. It's a message. It's your nervous system in conversation with the environment. For years, I trusted that instinct as a designer, long before I had the words or the science to support it. I knew certain spaces helped people exhale, relax. I could sense when a layout made someone feel overwhelmed. I'd noticed the light in a room and how it changed the way someone opened up or withdrew. Back then, I thought it was just a part of having a good eye or an intuitive nature. But the more I began to study neuroscience, the more I understood how real, how measurable, and how deeply human this relationship between space and mind actually is. The spaces we live in aren't simply background to your lives. They're part of the equation of how we think, how we relate, how we function, and even how we heal. Every texture, sound, quality of light becomes a kind of signal, and the brain, always listening and adapting, shapes itself in response. Once I grasped that, it changed the way I do everything, not just how I design for others, but how I parent, how I structure my days, how I create a sense of safety in my own routines and rhythms. Because space doesn't just hold what we do, it shapes who we become. There's a story I carry with me that brings this into focus. Jonas Salk, the scientist who developed the polio vaccine, once shared that his most important insight didn't come during a lab session or through a formula. It came during a stay in a quiet monastery in Italy, surrounded by stillness, natural light, and architectural harmony. His thinking shifted, something opened. He credited the environment itself for clarity he had been seeking. That story moves me every time because it reflects something that we all sense deep down. That transformation often requires more than effort. It requires the right conditions. We spend so much time trying to optimize our minds, our workflows, our habits, and yet the spaces we move through, the places we create, live, and work in play just as powerful a role in how well those efforts land. They hold the rhythm of our days. They support or strain our capacity to focus, to rest, and feel at ease. When those spaces are intentionally designed to nourish us, everything begins to move with a different kind of ease. That's what today's capsule is about. It's the beginning of a series on neurodesign, not as a trend or a buzzword, but as a deeply human practice, a way of seeing design not just as something visual, but as something relational, experiential, something alive, something that shapes and is shaped by the nervous system, the emotions, and the quiet inner architecture of being human. And today, we start with one of my favorite concepts, which is enriched environments, spaces that invite the brain and the body to function with more ease, creativity, and resilience. We'll explore how they work, what makes them feel supportive, and why even small shifts in our surroundings can create meaningful shifts in how we feel, think, and move through our lives. So, if you've ever changed one thing in a room and felt yourself breathe easier, if you've ever walked into a space and suddenly felt more like yourself, you already know the power design holds. This episode will simply give you the language and the intention to start shaping it on purpose. Let's begin with something simple, something we often overlook. Your brain is always adapting. It's responsive. It's constantly adjusting, rewiring, evolving based on what you experience. And what's especially fascinating, what feels deeply relevant on how we live and design, is that this adaptation isn't shaped solely by your thoughts or our behaviors. It's also shaped by your environment. What surrounds you plays a role in what your brain becomes. This link between the spaces we inhabit and the function of the brain was first brought into focus by one of the most important early studies in neuroplasticity led by the neuroscientist Dr. Marian Diamond in the 1960s. She placed rats into different types of environments. Some were isolated in sterile cages, while others were placed in what she called enriched environments. Spaces filled with toys, mazes, textures, novelty, and social interaction. What she discovered was stunning. The ones that were in the enriched environment didn't just act differently. Their brains were more active, more connected, more vibrant. And the richness of their surroundings had literally enhanced the complexity of their brains. What that study revealed was the shift in thinking. It showed that the brain could be shaped by genetics, yes, by our childhood, but also by our environment. And then, decades later, in the 1990s, neuroscientist Dr. Fred Gage expanded this research further. He and his team showed that neurogenetics, which is the creation of new neurons, continues well into adulthood, particularly in the hippocampus, the region of the brain associated with learning, memory, and emotional regulation. And he discovered that in rich environments, those that were meaningfully varied and engaged could stimulate this process. So let's pause here for a second because I think this is the moment it really lands. When we design a space, when we choose the lighting, the textures, the layout, the rhythm of movement, and sound, we're not just creating ambiance. We are supporting the biology of the people who live and work there. We're creating conditions for learning, emotional balance, and creativity to happen. We're either helping the brain thrive or making it work harder. And while the phrase enriched environments might sound academic, it's actually very human. It's about the kind of spaces that invites engagement, so sensory engagement, emotional engagement, a sense of variation and rhythm. And it's the difference between walking into a blank, windowless room that flattens your energy versus stepping into a space where the light changes throughout the day, where the textures are soft, where there's beauty without clutter, where there's calm without silence. Spaces that feel alive in a way that makes you feel more alive too. And when that happens, when a space actually supports your nervous system and your mental clarity, something shifts. You process more easily. You recover more gently. You're not constantly compensating for your environment. You're being held by it. This is what enriched environments offer us. Not more stuff, not more stimulation, but meaningful input, the kind the brain knows how to respond to. And when we design from that place, we're not just creating something beautiful, we're shaping something deeply supportive, something that helps people return to themselves. And now that we've grounded ourselves in the idea that enriched environments influence brain structure, let's see how that shaping actually happens physiologically. Because our experience of space begins in the body. Long before we label a space, our nervous system is already responding to it. I'll mention you two examples. Let's start with light. Natural light does so much more than help us see. It regulates one of the most essential systems in our body, the circadian rhythm. And I'm sure maybe you've heard of it. It's our internal clock, which governs sleep, focus, digestion, hormone production, and energy cycles. There's a study from the University of Illinois that found that office workers with access to daylight had fewer headaches, less eye strain, and better sleep. But the real insight isn't about symptoms. It's about readiness. When the light in your space supports your biology, we do not just feel better, we think more clearly. We process more efficiently. The brain isn't fighting the environment, it's moving with it. So that's light. Now let's turn into the second example, which is sound. Even in the quietest rooms, there's always some kind of auditory input. And your nervous system is listening to it, evaluating every sound to determine whether it signals safety or threat. This means that environments filled with mechanical hums, unpredictable interruptions, or intelligible background conversations can stimulate your brain's stress response. Over time, this kind of chronic auditory stress can impair memory, reduce learning capacity, and elevate cortisol levels, which by now you may know that's the stress hormone, all of which limits the brain's adaptive capacity. But the opposite is also true. When we're surrounded by natural, gently rhythmic sounds like bird songs, water, or wind, our nervous system enters a different state, one of regulation, one of openness. A study from the Max Planck Institute found that exposure to natural soundscape increased concentration by up to 20%. Not because the sounds are motivational, but because they help the brain shift into safe engagement. And that type of engagement is the only place where deep learning, creativity, and healing can happen. And it's not just light and sound, as I gave you the examples. Everything from temperature to scent to airflow contributes to what the body perceives as supportive or demanding. This is why sensory balance is so crucial, because when a space overwhelms the senses, the nervous system defaults to defense. But when the sensory environment is supportive, the body finds regulation. And from that regulated state, the brain can think, it can focus, it can rewire. So when we talk about enriched environments, we're not talking about abundance or luxury. We're talking about intentional, balanced, and human-centered conditions that allow for physiological calm and cognitive clarity. The kind of balance that makes space functional, but also transformational. Now that you have this information, and before we move towards application, I want to slow down and acknowledge something important here. Everything we've talked about so far, how the brain adapts, how the space interacts with our senses, how light and sound shape our physiology, it's all rooted in science, yes. But here we're talking about well-being, and well-being is subjective. And to address subjective well-being, we need to look at context, because context is very important. It matters because not all enriched environments feel the same to everyone. What soothes one person might be overstimulating another. What feels calming and supportive in one culture or stage of life might feel empty or limiting in another. And not every study lines up perfectly either. Some research finds big impact from nature views or sensory input. Others find that those same effects depend on things like mood, sleep quality, emotional state, or even trauma history. Because the brain doesn't live in a vacuum. It carries stories, habits, and memory into every space it enters. One of the things I found especially relevant in the research, particularly in the work of Fred Gage, is this. Even in environments proven to stimulate brain growth, neurogenesis was most active when the environment remained dynamic. In other words, it wasn't just in the presence of stimulation that mattered. It was the variation, the change, the sense of discovery. And this tells us something big. Even an enriched environment can become neutral if it never evolves. Our brains crave rhythm, yes, but it also responds to freshness, to surprise, to small meaningful shifts that wake up awareness. So when we talk about designing environments that support the brain, it's not about creating the perfect setup and then walking away. It's about creating systems that stay responsive, that adapt to people, to time, to seasons, and to needs. This is where design gets interesting because we're not designing for a general user. We're actually designing for this person in this moment with this nervous system and this lived experiences. And this requires something more than just knowledge. It requires presence, observation, empathy. So if there's one thing I want to be really clear about here, it's this. There is no perfect version of an enriched environment. There are only principles and the way we translate them with care into real life. So it's not about applying science to space like a rule book. It's about using science as a compass, not a script, and letting the design evolve through feedback, awareness, and human sensitivity. So here's your invitation for the week. Choose one space you use regularly: your kitchen, your desk, your entryway, your workspace, and spend a few minutes simply observing it, not with the intention of judging it or fixing it, okay? Just look at it with curiosity and ask yourself, what message is this space sending to my brain on repeat? Is it inviting me to settle, to focus, to breathe? Or is it overstimulating me, depleting me, or simply disconnecting me from what I want to feel? Once you've noticed something, even something small, choose one intentional shift. It could be as simple as letting in more natural light, softening the sounds in the room, clearing visual clutter, or bringing in a texture or object that feels grounding. Or maybe alive. It just has to be deliberate. Neuroplasticity reminds us that nothing in us is fixed. Our brains are always adapting, and our environments are part of that process. Every sensory input interacts and influences our nervous system. If this episode resonated, feel free to share it with someone who might need a soft entry point into this conversation. Also, follow us so you don't lose any new episode drop every Tuesday. Stay well, stay curious, and keep designing your life with intention. See you next time.